Just so people are aware, we're about to go live.
Hi, I'm Audrey Wenning with the Metropolitan Planning Council. I am pleased to welcome you to a conversation about capital planning and transportation in 3 wards in Chicago. So I'll give a little bit of a rundown of kind of what we're hoping to go through today, and then we'll be taking questions later in the session. So as you're listening to the conversation, please feel free to put questions into the chat and we'll get to them later in the event. So as folks may be aware, the Metropolitan Planning Council is a nonprofit policy and advocacy organization, and we focus on planning issues to create a more sustainable and equitable region. And we're really happy to be here to have this conversation about capital improvement planning, because we are in the budget cycle right now, but we know that the city is going to have reduced resources. And it's a great time to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of how the city decides on what infrastructure to fund via our current system. So a capital improvement plan includes capital projects, equipment purchases, major studies for the local government. It's really the intersection of planning, public works, and finance. So this is something that's going to be updated this fall. However, there are a few observations that we have that we want to bring into the conversation. The city of Chicago does not currently have a comprehensive plan defining a vision for the future and the infrastructure investments needed to get there. However, the good news is, for the first time in decades, efforts are being started to develop one, and they are being initiated just this fall, so we will be getting one. Another observation is that Chicago does not have a lot of system-wide transportation plans. There's a bicycle plan, Streets for Cycling, with a target year of 2020, although less than half of the bike lanes planned in that have been completed. There is no plan for where priority bus corridors will be installed. The pedestrian plan is sort of a toolkit, doesn't identify projects. There's no traffic signal management plan, and there are a couple of Vision Zero plans at the neighborhood level, but to date there's been no budget for implementation in the capital improvement plan, although the city has committed to do so next year. The current CIP doesn't really identify well what projects are in there and how they are aligning with plans, partly because there aren't so many. And also another facet of this conversation is that we have specific structures in Chicago that affect a lot of our transportation funds and how they're used. For example, tax increment financing, which you've probably heard a lot about, TIF, captures the appreciation of property values in specific defined zones and puts the money into a special fund that can only be spent in the district where funds were raised. At the aldermanic level, there are menu funds, which you may have heard about. Each alderman gets $1.3 million to spend on local infrastructure investments. And so that's a major focus, and we'll be talking about that tonight. The city also relies a lot on special service areas for some neighborhood improvements, which are business improvement districts. And those are funds raised from businesses in a district, and those funds are often used on infrastructure projects, but only in places where there are special service areas. So a few observations that MPC has made are that funding sources seem to drive project selection in Chicago. While we have a good, clear finance piece in our CIP, it's hard to know how projects are chosen. It's not clear how we're forecasting our overall capital needs at the citywide level. And we're not sure exactly what bodies are providing oversight in terms of prioritization. So the bottom line is the public should understand what's being spent and why, but we can see room for improvement in how those decisions are made. And the purpose of our conversation today is to talk about what the on-the-ground experience is for aldermen in their wards as they seek to address infrastructure issues and to discuss how the capital planning process could work better in Chicago. So I'm thrilled to be here tonight, and we'll go through a few questions and just have an open conversation, and then we will, as I said, be taking questions in the chat box. So if you have anything that comes to mind, please jot it down and we'll get to that. So it's great to be here with Alderman Martin, Alderman La Spada, and Alderman Sigo Lopez. And the first question I think would be helpful to understand is, what has been your experience in the role of neighborhood planning, and how does it relate to citywide transportation planning? So anyone that wants to start is welcome to take that of the three of you.
Okay, long pause. We're waiting for who's going first. Okay, so thinking about transportation planning, I'm really grateful to be representing and serving a ward that is really committed to sustainable modes of transportation. We have well-used bus routes here. The first ward is a very cycling-heavy ward. When you think about Logan Square and Westtown, we have Milwaukee Avenue cutting through, which is kind of the backbone of the first ward, which means definitely the blue line is a major consideration. How we use Milwaukee Avenue has been a major consideration. And I've been really thankful for having both CDOT and our Community and Active Transportation Alliance, other groups, as real partners in transportation planning. It's reflected in the bus priority zones that we were able to work with the CTA on Western Avenue. It's reflective of the protected bike lanes that are going in place on a relatively small but integral stretch of Milwaukee Avenue over the next month now. But it also speaks to the challenges. Even that 1.3 million in infrastructure funding that we have, that isn't adjusted for inflation. That has been the same dollar amount for about the last 20 years. So we're working with a lot less functionally than our predecessors were. It's also hampered by the fact that as much as you want citywide planning and hopefully citywide aldermen who are committed to sustainable mobility, we also know that doing transportation planning on this kind of fractured ward level leads to, as we're seeing, like bike lanes that cut off based on what the boundaries of the ward are, rather than where they're most needed. So there's a lot of different challenges that we're dealing with, but I'll just make that as an opening.
I'll add to that, all of which I agree with. The fact that in a lot of ways we're, I think, cabined or confined to what we've inherited. Because if I think about the 47th ward, we're bisected by the Brown line. So we have about 7 L stops. We have the Ravenswood Metro stop, maybe the second busiest in the entire system. We also have a pretty decent bike infrastructure that we're working to expand upon when it comes to bike and pedestrian infrastructure more generally. But to Daniel's point, I mean, we struggle to really find ways to expand that sort of infrastructure, and certainly bus infrastructure to a greater extent in ways that extend beyond a pilot, because what's the point of doing it for several blocks or even upwards of a mile or two when that's not how folks experience the city? You don't think about, oh, I'm going from this ward to that ward and I have to think about the extent to which there are connections. That's just not how folks get around day to day, pre-COVID, of course, and then during COVID. So when we're talking about the sort of planning and then the money based on that planning, we learned recently that there's supposed to be some sort of alternative approach to menu funding that the administration is envisioning. To my knowledge, aldermen have yet to be brought into those discussions, but we've made clear our desire to be a part of that, and to be a part of it at the outset, not to just ask some questions and have an opportunity to nibble around the edges once a near final draft is shared, but instead be there on the ground floor when that's being built up. But at the end of the day, one of the things that we did learn in a recent briefing is the sorts of year-over-year capital improvements that need to occur in myriad ways, whether you're talking about lighting or our buildings or our roads and alleys, year over year, very underfunded relative to what you would need to have to keep pace. And so I think we really need to embrace some outside of the box thinking and really be able to, in part, bring in a lot more funding in order to do some transformational work. Otherwise, as I mentioned at the very outset of my comments, you're going to be really just responsive to what you find yourself in the ward. And a final example I'd leave folks with is, if you look at the 10th ward on the southeast side, they can fit 5 north side wards within the entirety of their boundaries. However, they get the same 1.32 million as everyone else. And that's just always going to be a recipe for, I mean, I don't think failure is too strong of a word in this regard.
Yeah, and very well, first of all, let me thank you for the invitation. I think it's great to share the panel with the MPC, and of course, Alderman Spada and Alderman Martin, who I truly respect in terms of the detail-oriented review of policy. When it comes to, I think the role of neighborhood level planning, you know, and the level of detail that we need to make sure that we protect not only the quality of life of residents, but also that we create an innovative and visionary way of the transportation for the future. So I tell you, it's been challenging. Of course, I do have a wonderful, very diverse area that I represent, you know, from the West Loop, Chinatown, Pilsen, Abla Homes, and McKinley Park. Little Italy is such a diverse area, and the different challenges that we have. I do think, you know, some of the comments that we see in terms of the importance of making sure that people are included in these decisions is critical, right? I think we oftentimes hear, proposals for transit-oriented development, right? We want to make sure that we're really, you know, involved in those conversations, because oftentimes, you know, we ended up having developments that have not only construction crews all over the place, blocking biking lanes, you know, oftentimes we have accidents created because of that. But even though we have transit-oriented development, sometimes that is giving all the green lights because of the proximity to a train station, because of the proximity to public transportation. But again, we don't have any kind of mechanism to ensure that we're truly creating the kind of policy to have a transit-oriented development that is mindful with the surroundings, and we ended up having the majority of the buildings having people who have 2 or 3 cars, and all of a sudden we have chaos in the area. I tell you, just in terms of neighborhood-based, detail-oriented development, and the importance of bringing people, advocates, residents to the table, so that we can see what's happening in our surrounding. I do hope, and I think with hopefully a new wave of officials, a lot of new aldermen, a lot of new faces, the culture of making sure that we have more people included in these conversations. I do truly believe in proper planning, and the planning can help us prevent these issues, but always when we have people at the table. Not too long ago, I used to be the director of Pilsen Alliance, but in Pilsen Alliance was involved in the fight to make sure that we have, more frequent stops, you know, on trains, in lines, especially the blue line, that we are not bypassed, right, by public transportation. Now we have a much better infrastructure. But I do think that there's still a need to make sure that people are at the conversations. I think neighborhood level planning must be starting not only with aldermanic office, but aldermanic offices must represent, the wide range of constituents that we have, the different challenges. The issue of equity is critical here. I do think that, we would love to see, I know Matt and Daniel have a wonderful plan, to protect bike lanes, in Logan Square and so on. So how do we create more of these? How do we create a more environmentally friendly, transportation system? And that includes, of course, the residents. I agree in terms of the lack of the lack of funding, oftentimes to create such policies, or many money, of course, is way too short, way too small, not adjusted by inflation for I don't know how long. And I think that we need to have this kind of coordination with CDOT in terms of what we can truly address with the limited menu, but also having, a city so diverse like ours, we need to make sure that we have citywide planning. That's what these conversations are so critical, to make sure that we are planning. I tell you, in my ward alone, we have so many different constituencies, challenges, and you will start talking citywide, we'll see even bigger challenges. So that's just, I guess some of the challenges that we see.
Great. We've already hit on a lot of really, I think, important issues, ranging from equity to underfunding to thinking about transportation as a system. And I can't help myself but mention, since you brought up transit-oriented development, for those that don't know, this week the City of Chicago just released its first equitable transit-oriented development policy plan, which is out for public comment right now through the end of October. It's a product of 80 stakeholders, a lot of collaboration with the city. So as folks are thinking about development and transit in their neighborhoods, this is a potentially a real game changer. So definitely take a look at that. But I also heard a lot of concerns about the menu program and possibly aspirations for a major change, which we don't know what it will be. But let's talk a little bit more about how you manage the menu program right now in your wards, and what are some of the pros and cons of it? What do you deal with on the ground? Again, anyone who wants to go first.
Yeah, I'll kick off with that. So we do a lot of in-person inspecting and taking photos, having our own internal database that warehouses that, and then when it comes to ultimate decisions, putting that information up online so folks can compare. And I think that there are several benefits to that. One is you are going around, say, looking at alley aprons, for example, one by one, it gives you a sense as to which ones are in really bad shape and which ones can make it through another year or two, which is important in part when folks reach out and say, well, how come mine didn't make the cut with regard to menu? You can say, well, you can go online and see and filter in good ways. And if you can show us that we missed something in terms of why your pothole was more deserving in terms of filling than someone else's, then I think that that's helpful. And so what we started doing was really trying to be a little bit more intentional about the buckets that we were using. So it's not just exclusively resurfacing, but we're thinking about how are folks engaging with that. And so with alleys, which I know is a hot button topic in a lot of communities, they're not especially widely used. Whereas if you think about sidewalks, especially along our arterial corridors, those are used tremendously, especially if they're situated by transit stops. And so we made a decision, hey, we want to invest more in our sidewalks, given the ways in which they're trafficked. And also from that accessibility and equity component, we know that too often they're overlooked, and that for folks who are differently abled, who might not be using cars as much as some other neighbors, it's all the more important that we keep our sidewalks up and running, and that those are relatively modest costs. When you compare to, for example, with a concrete alley, you want to redo that. It's what's called a green alley because it's more permeable than asphalt. We're talking about $250,000, sometimes more, $300,000, which, I mean, you could do 4 of those, maybe 3, and then that's kind of it with your menu. So I think for us, really biking, walking, occasionally driving throughout the ward and doing that surveying is really critical. And then we also think about what's something that maybe needs to happen next year. If there's a big construction project that's going to be happening adjacent to, say, a stretch of road that needs to be resurfaced, well, then let's wait until that construction work is done. But at the end of the day, I do think as we try to compare what we're doing with other wards, it's a very imperfect process because all of our wards are differently sized, it's different makeups. And so it is one of those situations where, while it's nice that we can have our fingers on the pulse of the community and being able to know and justify why these expenses are occurring, that absence of citywide planning that both Byron and Daniel were touching upon, you really feel acutely, because in a lot of ways, while it's great to have that localized experience, I don't think you need to be an alderperson or work in an aldermanic office to understand the severity of things and plan accordingly. So I think in some ways there's a little bit too much pushed down to us that we can use for political benefits, right? To be able to say historically, hey, you call me, I will take care of that thing using my menu money. Hopefully you'll remember that. But I think the trade-off there is not building up that muscle memory within our broader city institutions and resourcing them in ways that allow for more innovative and long-lasting infrastructure improvements.
Maybe we're outgrowing the menu program here, but what other experiences have you had?
Well, I would speak into that to say also, you are what you inherited. What the word you inherited speaks to the kind of investments you're going to make as an alderman. I was able to go online and find a 2016 report from the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability that showed over a 5-year period, the first ward was actually in last place in terms of menu money that actually went to core infrastructure. Only 61% of the first ward's menu money actually went to CDOT street, alley, and lights projects. And it shows in terms of the infrastructure that we inherited. So it's a lot of what Alderman Martin talked about, actually getting out there and like feeling the road. I can tell you, like as a cyclist, you really feel the road in different ways than if you're just driving through it, but also leaning into participatory budgeting. And I know this is something that a lot of us participating in is very a popular mode of getting the democratic power of your ward going. But I wanted to talk about that from the angle of making sure democratic process meets equitable ends. Because in our ward, there are those who have louder, more consistent political voices by nature of a lot of privilege. The disposable income that goes with being able to participate. And we wanted to make sure that if we just did project-based participatory budgeting, that all of our menu money didn't just end up in particular corners of the ward and leave out the more lower income communities of color within the first ward. So rather than just doing projects, we went with categorical participatory budgeting. We did a ranked choice ballot where you could say 1 through 5, do you want trees? Do you want alleys? Do you want streets resurfacing? And it was really helpful for us in understanding broadly what are the values, what are the felt needs of our ward around transportation planning. And now we're in the face of it. We're looking towards 2021. We're actually now working with teams of volunteers across the ward to translate those priorities into projects that make sense for the ward. But for me, it's been a really good lesson in how to balance those interests around democracy and equity in terms of how we do transportation planning.
Yeah. Well, to that, the only thing I get to add, I think that, Daniel and Matt made a lot of the points, but just to add with the complexity of participatory budget, right? I think that, and I do think that is best practices, and we got to get to a point where we get more of our residents to participate. The complexity, I tell you, in in communities like the 25th ward, where you have different languages, right? We have Chinatown, we have Pilsen, we have West Loop, Achille, Little Italy, and the challenges right now, as we were being in conversations, very good conversations with the Great Cities Institute in UIC in terms of the implementation of some of these policies. And it was being, especially now with the pandemic where now things are remote, a lot of our conversations were, very physical in a way. We have to make assessments on the ground. I think, we do receive information from CDOT in terms of like surveys that were done, and based on 311 requests and resurfacing needs and requests and so on, sidewalks, you name it. However, of course, there's nothing like, being out there and talking to residents, making sure that we have, or staff being out there to talk to residents and to review this request, but also making sure that the residents are at the table discussing, reviewing the priorities. The challenges, of course, right now with the virtual reality, and also, the constituencies, the equity becomes very important, making sure that people are able to be there. We know a lot of residents who are not able to be there because they're working, they work 2 or 3 jobs, and it's tough, especially when it talks about equity. It is really challenging to get there. But I'm really excited to hear my colleagues and how we are able to implement this in a way that is mindful. I think the issue of equity, again, remains a critical part of it. We've been cautious. I hope our goal is to move towards a fully participatory budget where we are discussing priorities based on need, based also equity. It's been difficult. All that has been out there and assessing this. It has been a challenge to make sure that we have the language component, have the studies, the service, participatory process, that really will incorporate equity.
Okay, great. Yeah, that was really interesting to hear kind of the perspective on the menu program. And also it's been referenced the 311 number that residents can call when they have an issue and they want something improved, and that goes directly to the city, to CDOT. So can you talk a little bit about, your menu doesn't cover that much. It only covers a really small amount of projects every year. Let's talk a little bit about what you count on CDOT to cover, and also maybe a little bit of what is the interaction in terms of 311 improvements and your aldermanic offices, and how does that all work together?
So for CDOT, what we often find ourselves relying for them on are the resurfacing of our arterials primarily, and then upkeep when it comes to some bike lanes, for example, and repainting them. Also some signal upgrades. We have streets like Ashland where there's a transit signal prioritization program where there's work being done there. I think that you do see, however, a situation where you have sister agencies like CTA that aren't always part of the same sort of conversations that you're having within the more closely knit city umbrella when it comes to specifically city council and departments like CDOT. So when you're talking about things like bus bump outs, CTA can be on board with it, but then you're thinking, well, is that really the highest and best use of our limited menu funds? And then sometimes the answer is unfortunately no. And if you look over to CDOT, well, there's not always tremendous capacity there. And while I have like absolutely tremendous respect for our new CDOT commissioner, Gia Biaggi, and also don't have experience with her predecessors, but I think historically, CDOT's struggled to get access to the sorts of resources that they really need. So I think for us, when CDOT can really bring a lot of assistance to the ward, most recently, it's been a little bit around planning as it pertains to shared streets. I think we were the first ward to bring that on board, followed closely by some others, including, if memory serves, the first ward. Greenway, we, I think, had one of the first ones in the city around Berteau, if memory serves, and we're about to bring Leland up on board as well. CDOT's been really instrumental with that. But again, I think absent these broader citywide initiatives, this planning process and the sorts of resources that back that up, lots of great people at CDOT, but really would love to see in future years more resources to pump into that important department.
Anyone else want to make a comment? You don't all have to answer every question, but yeah.
I guess I'll give like just a 30-second answer, which is to say one of my favorite days of my year last year was my driving tour with Commissioner Biaggi when she had come on, just touring the ward and talking about what could this look like, particularly looking at our problem areas. She loves finding the problems and working with you and your team on creative ways to solve them. So particularly CDOT, and I gotta give credit, if this gets to their ears, to Dave Smith and Brad Huff for working with us on the Protected Bike Lane project on Milwaukee Avenue. Great guys. The whole team is really thoughtful, and yeah, really enjoy having them as a partner.
Okay, well, let's keep going. So now we, as I mentioned at the beginning, we are in the capital planning process, and would be interested to hear, and I know you haven't been through many cycles of this before, but what is your expectation, or what has been your experience, at least last year, of engagement in the capital improvement programming process? Is that something that aldermen are engaged in, or to what extent are you participating in that? At the citywide level, yeah.
I mean, they've done a briefing for us on this through the Capital Technology and Economic Development Committee. It'll be very interesting to see. My first time out, I don't really know the ropes yet. I think the caution is not letting capital development, capital and infrastructure planning be too political of a process. So there's issues that are best, honestly, left to engineers. It's, in terms of sewer work, sometimes water main work, you don't want aldermen sometimes digging too deeply into some of the work, making too many things political. At the same time, where transportation planning is concerned, certainly if we're considering the urban forest of our city as part of our infrastructure, and arguably we ought to and we need to invest in it as though it were a part of our infrastructure, that's a part where I would love to play a stronger role. But I'm not entirely sure as yet what to expect. Love to hear from my colleagues on that.
As well as participation. Yeah, I think what Daniel is bringing up, again, we do have briefings. I hope that the briefings are translated into, and I think they're good ideas. I think they're good proposals. I think great conversation. For instance, in terms of in terms of structure, for instance, I know that we discussed electricity, for instance. What we made an assessment that we got $3 million worth of infrastructure upgrades that are needed. It's impossible for us to take on that. I mean, I know that there's a conversation on CDOT taking on such big infrastructure, which can free us to do other kind of infrastructure upgrades and ideas that we do have in mind. I do think that the inclusion from the aldermanic level perspective should be translated on including residents across the board. I think we do have conversations about bike paths in Pilsen, right, in across the 25th ward. I do think that those conversations need to be involved the residents. I know that we have even conversations about doing bike paths along industrial corridors, and I do think that this is planning that needs to be done carefully. I know that now there's a grant with the transportation federal agencies. My concern, of course, is to make sure that we do have a larger vision that includes, sustainable planning along the same area. For instance, a while ago, we were going to put a green corridor, right? A green corridor, sustainable corridor that never got funded. So now we got issues of maintenance and other issues. So again, I hope that these briefings and these conversations are translated ultimately in policies that can help us, start moving towards, transit buses, that can help us move towards usage of more public transportation, more bike, friendly streets, and that's the thing, something that requires not only planning but funding. And I think that's how do we plan and have this vision where we can prioritize needs. I mean, issues of accessibility too. I mean, there's a lot of issues that when we address, but I do believe that at the extent that we're able to be not only included, but also we can include the different communities, we don't lose the sense of equity, again, and not only on income, but also the advocacy for accessibility. And I think the vision of our city for not only that is exclusive, but that is inclusive, but also that is thinking ahead.
Well, it's so great to hear all of you really advocating for much more system-wide planning, big picture recognition that transportation is a system that the person on their bicycle, they don't care where the word boundary is. They just want to get where they want to go. And that a desire to not have infrastructure be politicized, but to have it be planned by professionals who can think at the system-wide level. And I think another thing that I heard was, really being able to think big. We've been in a process of really being under-resourced, but is there an opportunity to think about big opportunities and then estimate those costs and then find a way to pay for them so that we can have some transformative projects at the system-wide level. I also have heard a lot about equity, and I know that that's a real focus that we wanted to touch on today. Would love to hear, I know that it was mentioned that the wards are very different sizes. So geographically, if you're getting the same amount of money and you have a ward that's 5 times the size, you have a lot of infrastructure that you need to fix. And then populations vary by ward, and that those are equity concerns. Would love to hear from each of you if you have other suggestions and ideas for how to improve equity in transportation planning based on your experiences so far.
Yeah, I one of the things that I like to say in terms of transportation, I know that we brought the idea of transit-oriented development as one of those, I think good policies. I do think that, I know I saw some of the comments about the, some of the innovative ideas and policies that we can put into place in terms of transportation. The issue of equity oftentimes gets lost, not in the sense necessarily that the policy doesn't include it, but because there are other variables. I think talking about transit-oriented development, for instance, can housing, access housing, right? Because I do think as we bring amenities, right, bike paths and so on, I mean, we're having sale, for instance, in Pilsen. I think that a development, what people are concerned is, are we going to be part of this great ideas, these great policies? So I do think that at the extent that we can connect these variables, that we can have more families from the neighborhood to be able to use those bike paths, to be in those transit-oriented development projects, at the extent that we have more residents with disabilities able to access these projects and be able to have more accessibility in public transportation. At that extent, I think that we can truly talk about equity. So I will say that the issue of affordability it is intrinsic, equitable, and visionary approach to transportation. So I do challenge us to think about the issue of affordability as the issue of transit-oriented development, green ideas and transportation projects to be intertwined. I tell you, for instance, today when we talk about El Paseo, for instance, people are saying, well, we of course welcome the bycats, and we want to have more greener transportation, and we want to have the amenity, but also we want to be part of it. And I do think that's, I mean, we talk about the 606, we talk about the different amenities and transportation that has been improved over time, because sometimes advocacy of communities, I think that what we got to make sure that we continue to advocate in terms of equity is to be mindful that there are residents at this moment in time that need a kind of policy to be very carefully crafted to make sure that the affordability component and the inclusion in the discussions. I think that you often hear these concerns in public meetings. That's what I think, we want to make sure that we challenge CDOT, we challenge City Council to be able to make sure that we have conversations that are complex, of course, because, when there are multiple variables, there are policies that need more conversation, more dialogue to be able to have the impact that is desired. Sometimes the outcome is not often in line with the intention of the policy. So unintended consequences are real. And I think that transportation, and in my opinion, affordability, especially now on the right to the city, because I see a lot of displacement and a lot of opportunity here to make sure that we have this intergenerational conversation, right? To have young people, families, people with disabilities. We also be thinking about a city for everyone and not only for those who can afford it.
I'll add that as I briefly touched upon earlier, I think that it's really not smart planning to have so much of our infrastructure spending done via menu, and that there may be like two things to peel off from there. One being that we should, at least for certain items, say, okay, we're going to continue to use menu funds on this. And then I think apportion funds that are roughly equivalent to the size of wards, if it's envisioned that part of like what you would use those funds are for things like street lights, resurfacing, and the like. I think, however, there are some things where we might want to pull that out of menu funding, or at least treat it somewhat differently, insofar as both touching upon a lot of the equity-based considerations that Byron mentioned, but what Daniel had started off the conversation around with things like biking and making sidewalks and other things more accessible. Maybe that's something that we want to pull out of the menu process and instead have someone at CDOT run point on that to make sure that you don't have these gaps in service based on a particular alderperson's willingness or lack thereof to invest in something. But I think to one of our earlier questions, if we can solicit aldermanic input at the front end there so that there's buy-in, if we say, hey, we are committed to doing X number of or a certain number of miles of X, Y, or Z, and get aldermanic feedback on that and say, okay, generally these are the sorts of areas where there's a real lack of investment when it comes to that, but then trusting our city bureaucrats to take the ball and run with it, because I think right now we kind of have an inverted relationship in that regard. So yeah, I think just going to show that there are ways in which we can think creatively around how to modify the process.
Only would add to that two conflicting examples, one being North Avenue in the first ward. So from Kedzie down to Damon, just got resurfaced with a lot of pedestrian islands, new crosswalks, bump outs, bike lanes, striped bike lanes on both sides. This would have been impossible, this level of equitable, sustainable, complete streets design, if it wasn't in a TIF district. having it in a TIF district literally was the mechanism to make this kind of funding and infrastructure improvements possible. The converse of that is Western Avenue, which is the one bisecting line of the First Ward, where I was literally told on a ride-along, disappointingly, that Western was too wide and busy for a Complete Streets remake. That's a broken frame for thinking about that street, particularly as I see now living off of it, so much more pedestrian use. Some of us who are even right now foolhardy enough to even try cycling on Western. We need to change that frame. We need to think of every city as having, every street as having a more equitable function to it, even if that is challenging. And really have CDOT or the federal government, Yusuf, you're absolutely right. Again, the comments, the chat, really interesting. But we need to make sure whatever the mechanisms are, whatever the funding needs to be in place, that we're exploring whatever the Complete Streets options are there.
Oh, great. Those are really insightful comments. Time is going really quickly with this great conversation. So let's turn to a few of the questions from residents. We're seeing one of the issues a resident is seeing related to public infrastructure is developers damaging property, sidewalks, alleys, crosswalks during construction on private property. How do the wards and the city keep developers accountable for damage, and what can residents do to help in this process? Anyone want to take that one?
Part of the challenge with that is enforcement over restoration. Certainly, every time there's an opening of the public way, there is a clear and detailed restoration plan that is supposed to go into that in terms of both the sidewalk, the parkways, the street. They know what they're supposed to do, but I think there have been times in the past where developers used their relationship with aldermen to skirt some of those relationships. I think it's those requirements. I think it's been helpful for some of them that our city right now, I think only has about 1822 public way inspectors for the whole of this city. So really it's a response triage kind of system for getting public way inspectors out there. In our ward, they actually call those spaces where there was a concrete patch in the street after development that never got fully restored. They call those gentrification speed bumps because of what they represent and what the impact on our public way is. So I think there's, not that the plans aren't there for good restoration, but we need to invest in CDOT public way inspection strongly enough to make sure developers are actually accountable to that restoration work. Same thing I would add for like People's Gas or ComEd or whoever is doing that work. Like there needs to be, I would say, stronger systems of accountability.
Great. Let's move on to another question where we've got lots of good engagement here in the chat. There's a comment that Illinois DOT is a huge issue in terms of having complete streets and equitable multimodal streets. How can we pull them in to be better partners in making our streets better?
We've encountered that issue along Irving Park recently. And I think part of the solution, depending on the situation, is engaging our state colleagues. I'm really lucky, and I think my colleagues would say the same in terms of great state representatives and senators that you have good working relationships with who are looking for ways to do this sort of community outreach, right? I think too often they feel like the inverse is true of a lot of folks think of them as legislators, but that there isn't as much of an opportunity for that constituent services approach that a lot of folks associate with our offices. And so we've had really good experiences engaging our state colleagues, our legislative colleagues, to talk to IDOT and other state agencies for assistance. I will say with regard to Irving Park specifically, we recently learned that there are opportunities through which CDOT will play a more active role. And so as a result, it becomes incumbent upon us to figure out how we want to proactively engage CDOT around the sort of visioning opportunities that we've been discussing. Will that always be successful or get us where we want exactly as quickly as we would like? Not always, but I do think that sometimes figuring out whether it's working with our state colleagues or seeing if CDOT can kind of step in and carry some of the heavy load to get this across the finish line is going to be increasingly important for us along streets like Western and Irving.
Yeah, I like to just briefly give an example on Western Avenue, Western and 33rd, where we had, an issue there for a long time. And I think that lack of coordination, have multiple accidents, not only cars and bikes, and in a very dangerous intersection. So I think that and I think just basically what Matt had mentioned, I think the coordination between the agencies, right? The coordination between the CDOT and IDOT, but also between public officials where we can help bring the residents. I think the discussions with residents have been very informative for us to be able to come out with a plan between CDOT, IDOT, and understanding, identifying, because I saw someone just posted in the chat, crashes are preventable. Absolutely they are. When we don't have that kind of level of planning, it is only one agency, especially an agency that is not true like the local agency, and we don't have conversations. I think that before us, there was like 2 or 3 things that were tried and nothing worked. We hope that our planning now with residents, CDOT, and IDOT hopefully can give us a better solution to prevent crashes and accidents. But just to say that the engagement with the state representative that also put together an assessment and a conversation with residents in conjunction with the office so that we were able to present to CDOT a recommendation that I do think is going to be more effective than what we had in the past. So I think the level of coordination, I think, is critical between agencies, but also local officials who can engage, the agencies that are, worry about the biking lanes, as well as the residents who worry about crashes, And I tell you, I will say, quickly that Daniel has inspired me to be more out there, in the bike. So I have become, definitely he's a great advocate. I don't want to go unnoticed. For us to go out there and just try it out, right, ourselves and see how dangerous it is. So I want to recognize Daniel's. I think his commitment. I've seen him going such long distances that put me to shame. So I want to say, definitely has been inspiring and also eye-opening, so that you can understand policy from different perspectives. So I just want to make sure I don't forget to.
Well, I appreciate that. The real trick is that I'm actually. I believe, I haven't checked the record books, but the only alderman who has never had a driver's license. But my wife is forcing me to correct this, but certainly I'm lucky to live in a city where up until 39, I've never actually needed that. Like, we have a city that lends itself to a multi-mobile lifestyle, but certainly with kids coming into the picture, they need their dad to be able to drive them around some places.
That's great to hear. So we'll go through one more question, and it's maybe one of the more challenging ones. So as I think transportation planners certainly know, the city under Daley leased out all the parking spaces to a third-party operator for all of our lifetimes, 75 years. And that is a very restrictive policy, in that you have to compensate for that parking revenue when you want to remove parking, which is what you would often want to do to develop bus rapid transit or bike infrastructure. So how are you dealing with this large long-term challenge as you're trying to develop sustainable transportation in your wards?
If I may-
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm just going to speak to it practically speaking, like that's something that we needed to take on for the bike lane project we're doing on Milwaukee, because it is a project that's requiring us to remove the parking from one side of the street, alternating in some places. But that's about 102 paid parking spaces that, based on this deal with LAS, we needed to find other spaces to move them to. It was almost the biggest headache of actually doing the project, is figuring out where do you move all of these different spots to. So that's been a challenge. And based on the fact that they've already made their investment back, they're looking at 60 years of gravy at this point. Feels like a hard deal to negotiate unless we get to the point where mobility on demand has so taken over Chicago, as it may, that parking starts to have a reduced value to it. But then again, well, ding, 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 you're right. But I mean, the trick of the deal, Pixel, is that we have mandated minimum payments that they're also entitled to. It is really one of the worst deals our predecessors saddled us.
Yeah, all of that is right. Two quick points to add. One is, I think this will vary ward to ward in terms of adjacent areas that are really, I think, good fits for adding or removing those metered spots too. We find that there are situations where we have those available when we need them, which is great, but I suspect there are situations where colleagues of ours are not in that sort of situation. I'm thinking about folks that might be a little bit closer to the lakefront. I have not spoken with them about this particular issue, but I know that if it's a little bit of a challenge for us at times, it has to be a real significant challenge for them. I think the second point is we're in the process of embarking upon budget season, and we need to pay attention to decisions like the parking meter deal. Hopefully something like that won't come up again in our lifetimes, right? That we've learned that lesson. But you hear a lot of times, like, for example, one-time revenue sources versus structural fixes. That parking meter deal was a one-time fix so that Mayor Daley and some of his closest allies on council could avoid harder decisions like property tax increases and other things that we not only are confronting right now, but because of their poor work, we'll be confronting year after year after year. So let's make sure we're confronting those challenges, dealing with them head on. And so when you hear that council and the mayor's office are considering one-time revenue things, really make sure that you're viewing that skeptically and asking follow-up questions, just like we're endeavoring to do in our jobs.
Great. Well, I think we're at time here. This has been a great conversation. Time just flew by. There's so much to talk about. So just to conclude, I think we are all hearing about the value of planning. It warms my heart to hear that. And just everyone that's watching and listening today, keep an eye out for the comprehensive plan efforts the city is undertaking, and certainly take a look at the equitable transit-oriented development policy plan that's out on the street. That's very innovative. They're taking public comment. And then also keep in mind that Alderman Martin has a transportation infrastructure community council that anyone can become involved in, and has led many events like this. So thank you so much for inviting Metropolitan Planning Council to be involved, and for the thoughtful comments by some of our more innovative aldermen. So thank you for inviting us, and thanks for being here, everyone.
Thank you for having us. Have a good night, y'all.
Thanks,
To
everybody.
mention that. Thank you, everybody.